There are two pipelines that come from Russia to Germany, and the worry was that Russia was weaponizing its gas and oil. Biden wanted an option to blow up the pipeline. He was worried that Germany was under pressure to put more money into the war in Ukraine. They were asked to come up with options. And one of the options that emerged is blow up the place. And the CIA was given that assignment. The classic thing for the head of the CIA is, does he work for the Crown or the Constitution? And most CIA directors decide they work for the Crown. All he had to do was say, if he was really innocent, last September when this happened, who did it? He's never asked the question because, of course, he knows the answer. His policies right now are, let's see, I hate Russia, I hate communism, I hate China. And how's that working out? China's writing us off.
Will Putin use nukes, do you think?
No. He just wants Ukraine to stay neutral.
The US government is giving money to Zelensky. Zelensky and his crew are skimming a chunk off the top, and then they're buying diesel from Russia, their enemy, to continue to keep the war going. The Biden administration knows they're taking some off the top. We know you're skimming, but you're skimming too much. So keep skimming, but skim less, because we need you to keep this war going so I can get elected. That's what you're saying is going on here.
It's scary how simple it is. It's all about re-election.
So is anyone motivated to actually come to peace here?
The deal I hear that would work is ceasefire. The borders are where they are. Demilitarization of Ukraine is going to be the sticking point. He's going to say, you want to stay? Get rid of what you got and get it done. We do not want a militarized, NATO built up Ukraine next to us.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is... This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Seymour Hersh, the investigative journalist, political writer, and author. You first gained widespread recognition in 1969 for exposing the My Lai massacre and its cover-up during the Vietnam War. From there, you went on to cover the Watergate scandal for the New York Times and also reported on the secret U.S. bombing of Cambodia. For your work, you've received the Pulitzer Prize for International Reporting, a record 5 George Polk Awards, and 2 National Magazine Awards. Last time, we discussed how the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipelines was carried out by the CIA, U.S. Navy, and the Norwegian Navy under the direct order of President Biden. Since then, you have published an article outlining how the U.S. government and intelligence agencies concocted a cover-up story to explain away the pipeline sabotage. You've also recently claimed that President Zelensky and the Ukrainian government are involved in a major corruption scandal that leads right to the heart of the Biden administration. Seymour, welcome back to London Real.
Hello.
Hello. It's great to have you here. I can't wait to dive even further. There's a lot of new information. There's a lot of misinformation and disinformation. But Seymour, for people that maybe haven't been watching the news for the last 6 months, can you just bring people quickly up to speed as far as what is Nord Stream, what happened to it on the 22nd of September, and then why did you make this assertion that America were the ones that blew it up?
Well, of course, what is Nord Stream is a good question. There are two pipelines that come from Russia to Germany, and the United States partly, and Great Britain, all of us as part of the notion of containment of Russia, containment of communism that started after World War II, have always been, particularly by 1960, 62, when Russia began building pipelines that were going to go through Western Europe into Western Europe, and they have so much gas and oil there, and it's very much less expensive, easy to get to. And the worry was Jack Kennedy was the first president to really start talking about it. It was that Russia was weaponizing its gas and oil in the Cold War. It was weaponizing, particularly with Germany. Germany was, as you know, they had a hell of a time after World War II. They just spent, 10 years of bombing, raping, murdering Western Europe. And they had to show Western Europe they could be good neighbors after the war. And so they became an industrial powerhouse and a big, great trading partner, largely due to the fact that they were getting Russian oil and gas, mostly gas, at a very cheap price. And this went on despite worry, but Germany wanted that gas. And what the countries we now call NATO countries, which NATO was set up in 1949, needed German gas to keep their people warm and profitable. And so in 2011, a major pipeline that was financed largely by oligarchs from Russia, 51% and 49% by 4 different private companies in Europe, invested many billions of dollars to build a 750-mile pipeline directly from Russia into Germany, producing 40% of the gas that Germany needed for a year. 40% in one big pipeline. That ran for 10 years until Putin, and because of the problems we now have, the war began. And by the way, nothing justifies what Putin did, starting the first major war in Western Europe. That's not acceptable. So this isn't a pro or anti-Russian thing, but this has to do with you can't like what Russia did. On the other hand, the first pipeline was such a success, and Putin shut it down himself. Meanwhile, a second pipeline was built called Nord Stream 2. That was the one that was blown up last September, as you just said. And it was full of gas. It hadn't started working yet because Chancellor Scholz of Germany, who's pretty much in our pocket, I would say, sanctioned it, stopped it. And when he stopped it, it was full of 750 miles worth of methane gas. And that's what blew up. And so in last fall, right before, in the end of September, as you said, it was blown up. And the mystery was who did it and why. It was an act of, you can call it sabotage, terror, war crime. There's been no judicial decision yet because nobody's acknowledged it. And so it was a mystery. And in October, I have friends that I was people that I was dealing with for 30, 40 years. That, people in America, when people retire, they still are called upon. They're asked to come in. And this was Biden wanted an option to blow up the pipeline. And why did he want that? He was afraid that at some point, by September, the war wasn't looking like it's going to be anything but a draw. It's still, you can take it any way you want it. It's still not looking like much of a victory for anybody, but the odds are the people I know who see some really interesting intelligence and are close to the military, I think it's all Putin's call. How much energy how much money does he want to put into it? And unlike us in the West, Putin controls his arms manufacturing. He doesn't have to get contracts with Northrop Grumman. He could just say, I want more. So he's got a lot more weapons at his disposal, a lot more troops that he hasn't put into the game. And I think at this point, it doesn't look so good. But last September, Biden's worry, as much as I can tell, I'm not in his head, the worry was that West Germany and Europe, there's no natural gas, no natural oil in that area. They've always been dependent on outsiders for their gas and oil. He was worried that Germany was under pressure to put more money into the war in Ukraine. And it looked to a lot of people, even people, believe it or not, in NATO, it looks like they're throwing a lot of bad money, a lot of good money after bad. We've now put about $120 billion into that war at a time when we just cut off 15 million people from medical care. Just cut them off at the bottom. We have acute problems like certainly Britain does too. You have to subsidize an awful lot of people in your country to keep it going, particularly on energy. And so I think the only rational explanation I can get from this is that Biden's fear is that Germany at some point may choose to keep gas going in lieu of supporting the war. And so he didn't give him the option. If this is so, this will play out very badly this winter. Europe had a very mild winter, but still prices for energy have gone up astronomically in Germany. And if you're a major, let's say a company, a construction company that's got a big project, you're out of Bonn or maybe out of Berlin, you got a big project in Munich, you're going to build a big housing complex. You have to think, I can't factor in how much my energy costs are going to be. So this stalls a lot of business. And look, the people in Europe are much more interested in this story than you might think. I mean, I don't do politics, and I'm not going there to do speeches, but there's a lot of concern about what happened. And so far, the German government has gone along with the American notion that we don't know nothing. And it's been a sad sort of story for the media because they simply don't want to get around the idea that a president, and in America now, we were terrified by the Trump administration. And so if you want to know what I really think my guess is Biden's certainly going to run again. He'll be 86 when he's done. And I think if anybody's got a shot at being the next candidate, it's Trump again.
Yeah.
If you're going to charge him with paying money to pay off, some babe, you're talking about something that goes on a lot more than we want to talk about. You're not going to get this guy in that case. In fact, you've made a lot of money for him and a lot of voters. So I don't know what's going to happen with him. He's a unique individual. I don't like him very much. On the other hand, a lot of people in America do. And right now, Biden's among the Democrats, he's at 32% in terms of wanting to run again. So we're looking at a real crisis in politics here. And so there's just been a wall. He did such a dumb thing, whether it's certainly illegal in terms of the law we know, economically, he's liable for the damages, whether it's an act of war is to be decided by not me. But the resistance to the story, as you know, we talked about it when I was on your show a few weeks ago, maintains strong. And when I mentioned the cover story, at some point, when you do an operation like this, the CIA was asked last winter, actually in the 2021, before 3 months before Russia invaded in February of a year and 2 months ago, they were asked to come up with options. So what can we do to forestall them? And there were meetings, and I described them in a lot of detail. And one of the options that emerged is blow up the place. And the CIA was given that assignment. Other agencies were involved too. And Norway is, of course, I actually wrote about this later. Norway has worked with us under dirty tricks in Vietnam. And we were operating inside North Vietnam sort of without anybody in America knowing it. And their hosts the corporations that run some of the largest private merchant marine ships have also done things for us. We just have a long relationship. It's got a 1,400-mile border along the Atlantic Ocean. It goes all the way and meets Russia at the Arctic Circle. And way up north, we've probably put, if not $500 million, more than $1 billion worth of new bases. We've upgraded air bases. We built a new it was a closed submarine base they had Norwegians used in World War II. We rebuilt it. We put in a more advanced radar. We monitor Russia we made Norway a number one target for Russia too, by the way. But the Norwegians are great sailors. And the first thing that the CIA team that was involved was to head to Norway, because we don't know much about the Baltic Sea. And the one thing about the Baltic Sea that makes putting a mine and blowing up a pipeline under the water is there's no gas and oil there. So what do? If you're an American ship, you suddenly show up and a bunch of divers jump in and a week later something goes off. I mean, that can't work. So it's complicated. And the team ended up thinking, people in the intelligence profession, I'm sure you know some people from some of your 5 and 6 people, they're pretty smart people. And in the end, even though they did what the president told them to do, they began to like it less and less. It didn't make sense, because the option of blowing up a pipeline and, the Norwegians use in World War II, we built a new we first of all, how do you hide it? I mean, how do you hide who did it? And so here we have the United States of America now in the position, Michael, and of course, what they did is they built a cover story.
Yeah.
You can't do an operation unless you have a cover story in case it's blown. And the cover story was
because I think last time we spoke, Seymour, the cover story hadn't broke yet, and I think you told the only thing that was happening is that everyone was calling you out, saying where are the sources. You're like, I'm not going to name my sources, but anybody who knows my record knows that I know what's going on and that my sources are always there. And so that's the way they were attacking your credibility. And I think you said, Brian, the German chancellor is going to DC next week and we're going to see what happens. I think that's kind of where we left it. And then from there, the chancellor went there. And then I think we saw this cover story emerge in the New York Times. That's what's happened, I think, since the last time you were here. The
chancellor went there on his plane, big luxury, just like we have an Air Force One, a big, beautiful plane with no reporters. That rarely happens. Went there by himself. No state visit, no joint press conversation with the president. We have a chain of motels called Motel 6. That's about $15. And my joke was, we probably put him up in a Motel 6 for that night. We have no idea where he spent the day. Came on a Thursday or Friday. It was a Thursday, I think. And the next day, they finally had one event from him, a 10-minute session in which each sat in front of the press corps. They were brought in, no questions to be asked. And they each had read from notes about how wonderful the other guy was. And then it was over. And then we learned, we learned a couple of days later, they had an 80-minute private meeting in which I did learn a little bit about, which is certainly did discuss. Joe Biden has a lot of reason to know what I can do. I could just tell you from his days in the White House. And there was times when he wanted me to do certain things. He knows I know things. I've been around, in this town for a long time, and I got here in 65. He became a senator in 72. He's an okay guy. He's just okay, not great. And his policies right now are, let's see, I hate Russia, I hate communism, I hate China. And how's that working out? China's now emerging as a major force and just, sticking it right in our eye, cutting a deal with the Iranians, cutting a deal with, of all people, the Saudis, buying oil in the yen, and probably going to start using its currency to buy oil. I mean, it's just amazing how we've lost leverage. And nobody pays attention to that very much. Anyway, the point of all this is, out of this emerged this amazingly strange story that they tried to sell, which was that a group of Iranian dissidents did it. And there was a boat called the Andromeda, named a classical Greek myth. A lot of boats are named with that name, including one of the top 100 biggest yachts in the world. It's an old folklore story about a beautiful virgin woman who was naked and saved by somebody. And a sort of interesting story. Anyway, the bottom line is they came up with this story and they had it all ready, that they had done it. And I got to tell you, everybody bit. It was a 49-foot yacht. Everybody bit on the idea that this yacht could sail to a point in the Baltic, 260 feet deep, drop an anchor 260 feet, and then have some divers go down. And divers have to have guys dress them. I mean, even though it's a modern lightweight, it's not like the old steel suits you saw. And they had to have, a mixture of gas, and you have to have a recovery facility for them when they come up. Otherwise, they spend all day down there. Coming up so slow, you have to go up, stop 3 times, and you don't want to do it on a covert mission. So that was the story they sold, and a lot of people bought it. And then I wrote a piece, because I just had to, saying that, look, that was all pre-planned by these guys. We, like your intelligence service, we have a lot of smart people in it, as I said. And it doesn't mean they're always right. They do what the president says. And these are guys who, the classic thing for the head of the CIA is, does he work for the crown or the Constitution? And most CIA directors decide they work for the crown, which always is a problem. That's always a problem because they end up doing things that are illegal. In this case, they did something illegal. And but they had a cover story. And the fact that so many people wanted to believe that story says so much about the resistance to the truth in this case. In the UN, there was a vote of 12-3 against doing an investigation, with the United States lining up to 12. And to this day, not one of the White House reporters has ever, in an open public, they're broadcast the daily news conferences with the press secretary. Nobody's ever gotten up and said, "Have you ever?" The United States president has the right to task. It's a formal word, task, the intelligence community, to solve a problem. All he had to do was say, if he was really innocent, last September when this happened, who did it? And he's never tasked the community. He's never asked the question because, of course, he knows the answer. And I don't know why. It's just so hard for the media to get over this. They just can't get to that. My guess is the paper I worked for, the New York Times and Washington Post, the other sort of standard liberal papers, are just so much afraid of another Trump or another Republican.
Right.
So they're going to back this guy.
They protect him either consciously or subconsciously. They want to protect him at all means, which means the truth goes out the window, or any form of real investigative journalist goes out the window, and they just ignore it and move on to the next thing, which is probably shocking for you to see that happening at the New York Times, a paper you worked at for a long time that used to be considered the crown jewel of journalism. And now they came out with the article and talked about the Iranians with the Bulgarian passports on the yacht. And look, Seymour, I had just spent an hour with you, and I know a lot of people that are up on the story, and I was almost laughing out loud because you told me that it takes experienced divers. You told me about the mixture of the gases that you need. You told me how complicated of an operation it is. And then they went to that island where there's a few people there, and they interviewed him, and they were like, "Oh yeah, we saw a few people on the yacht." And I'm just thinking, there's like 14 people on that island. Like, it's like, come on. I mean, you had to know.
We delivered food to them.
Yeah.
There must be a bunch of people. I mean,
it's just ridiculous.
And one of the great mysteries is they only destroyed 3 of the mines, and the 4th, what happened? What happened? And actually, a pretty good news reporter for a German newspaper came to see me, and was sort of mad at me for writing the story I did because he had a different point of view of it. But he said to me, his big problem was, well, he said, of course, the French and the Danes tried to go and recover the one mine that didn't go off. Remember, it's a mine. It's a C4 bomb, but underwater it's called a mine, and they didn't get it. And he said, and I said, I didn't say I agree with him. I said, why didn't they get it? He said, well, the Americans were there first. And I said, it was interesting to me. And I said, why did they get there first? And he said, you know how the Americans are. They want to be first. And the thing that was funny about it, it's really very simple why the 4th mine didn't go off. When you're down 260 feet underwater, you've got only 2 miners. The trick of a covert operation is you keep it very tight. That's what made the Norwegians so important. Norwegians fronted for us. It was a Norwegian boat. The Norwegians did the basic work, told us where we could hit both pipelines, send people down it. You have a shot of getting it. We trained for months in the Baltic Sea. And it's a very rapidly, turns over every year. It's a fast cooking and not very salty. Anyway, so what happened is they ran out of time. You can only stay down there about 15 minutes, and they ran out of time, and so they did 3, and they were told, get out of here. So there never was a 4th mine. But if there had been a 4th mine, which everybody thought, it's the most lethal thing in the world and the most difficult thing. It's an unexploded mine and powerful enough to blow up a New York City building. It's a big pipeline. They want to be sure they can get it. The pipeline is steel, but it's covered by a big concrete barrier that keeps salt water from getting near the pipeline. And it's most difficult job in the world to extricate one of those. And there's so much dumbness stuff going on. It's so obvious that you couldn't go pick up an empty mine. And then there were talks 2 weeks ago that they found some fuzzy thing. I don't know if you saw the story. There was a picture of some fuzzy thing underwater they thought could have been a sonar device that triggered the 4th mine that failed. And I'm sitting here thinking, there never was a 4th mine. Maybe I should have said that earlier. seemed like a small detail, but they made such a big deal out of it. And the Swedes and the Danes, I'm tired of pretending that maybe they didn't know. Come on. In that first story, for a lot of reasons, I didn't say they didn't know. What I said is the way I did a lot of negotiation about these words, that we never told them what they should have figured out. Okay, that's how we left it. That's how, because obviously they're allies. They don't like Russia. Sweden's trying to get in it in the UN. And the Danes, Denmark, I think was one of the first signers of the 19 initial signers of the NATO treaty. And so now, if you carry this out to where it's going to be, if this winter was mild, next winter the odds are will not be. They have more gas. They're paying more for it. In France, I know friends that are paying 5 times as much for electricity, because one of the things about having so much cheap gas is you run your generators on gas. You know, you don't have to have coal burning. And now they're talking about putting back 2 nuclear plants that were shut down because, you know, everybody knows what happened in Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island. They're shut down because they're terrific if you could be sure you can get people to run them right. And it doesn't. It turns out it's hard to do that. So they're thinking of reopening those, but that's not going to help a lot. And so what Germany did last year to get through the winter is they subsidized everybody's home. I can't tell you how many hundreds of millions of marks, in the billions. 20 to 20, some businesses would subsidize 25% their heating bill. That's not going to be able to be done this year. The money's not there. Right. So it's going to be a very rough, if the fall comes cold, he's going to be looking at tremendous anger from Western Europe because he's costing everybody a lot of money. It's 3 to 4 times as much for natural gas in Italy. Everywhere. It's inflation is booming, you know how it is here. And meanwhile, Biden keeps on asking Western Europe for more money and tanks. He's now got German tanks fighting in Russia for the first time since World War II.
Yeah, and I want to get into that war. I just want to finish up in the pipeline because there was the New York Times did the article on it, and then one of the reporters was put on a podcast, I think an internal New York Times podcast, and when they kind of pressed him more on the issue, he really seemed like he either didn't know or even the sources didn't seem even credible to him. And that story kind of finished up by saying, well, we probably know that we'll never really know. And it was, I've never ever heard a major paper like that report a story like that, where it's like, oh, it felt like they were literally phoning it in. They're like, we just are writing this story because we kind of have to, and we just hope that nobody asks us again. That's literally the way it sounded.
It's, I worked at, without getting, you're right. His message was, he did a podcast. He didn't have to do it. Right. The New York Times now is like a lot of newspapers, very audience, I subscribe to the New York Times and there's 15 different magazines and things I could get, you know what I mean? It's so full of, it's not, the business isn't newspapers anymore. The paid circulation used to be 1.7 when I worked there, 1.7 million. Now it's, 310 or 15,000. The newspaper's soon going to be gone. It's all going to be online.
Yeah.
But by the way, the other big riff about me is Unnamed Sources. And I worked at the New York Times for about 8 years, during which I won all sorts of prizes, wrote a story about domestic spying in the CIA. I'm not always a friend of the CIA's. They tried to kill Allende, and they probably did, but I'm never going to get that story. They certainly were involved in overthrowing him in Chile. And they did what the president asked. And they also were involved in spying on American citizens for Johnson. He thought everybody against the war was a communist and Russia was running it, that kind of nuttiness. But I did all these stories, won all these maybe 40 prizes in 7-8 years there. And 95% of them had no named sources. And the paper knew. In the beginning, the first few stories, they asked me, and I would tell them. One time, I'll just tell you one of the early stories I did, they asked me, and it was the chairman of a major committee and the head of the CIA with the unnamed sources. And I showed my notes to the end. After they said, I give up, go away. I don't want to hear what you do. So it's just bizarre to me. It's not about me. And it's not even about, I do this stuff on Substack. And by the way, it's a Substack. I hired the best editor I worked with in the last 30 years to work for me. And I hired the best fact checker. I worked at the New Yorker's magazine for, I don't know, probably 15, 20 years over the last 50. And always with a lot of hard stories, particularly after the invasion of Iraq, a lot of stories about CIA involved in the middle of Iran and all that. And the fact checkers know my people. And so I hired one of the best who's retired. He came out, he's having fun. It's fun to do it. You're going back into play and making noise. So I'm aware that I'm flawed. I can always screw up like anybody else. I can get the wrong date, or I can have the wrong story, or I can miss something. And so I have the best same backup I had, only I'm paying for it now, happily. And so what's the difference? The difference can only be, as I said earlier, a visceral fear of the coming of the Republicans. That's all I can think of.
Right.
And the same in the Washington Post. The Washington Post now has stories that begin. They'll have a story about Ukraine, and there'll be 5 bylines on it, and they'll say this story was written by the following, and they name them all. And I say to myself, that's the first lie. 5 people writing a story. That's the desk is writing that. The editor wants to know. That's her. She's a woman. It is a woman. And so they begin with a lie when they have all these names in a story.
Right. So they're towing the line because they want to make sure literally Trump doesn't get in office. And so the news is now all pro-Ukraine, and Ukraine is winning the war. That's the narrative here in Britain and in the US, which is not true from what I've heard from actually CIA sources. And the recent leak we saw from the Pentagon told us quite the opposite. And so what they're doing is they're suppressing anything that might not get Biden reelected, including, we saw a few years ago, thanks to the Twitter files, all the Hunter Biden laptop stuff, all those things where the staff at Twitter, in conjunction with what looked like the CEA and every other government subcommittee and agency, was trying to plant this Russian collusion story, trying to suppress that laptop story. And they corrupt the journalism at the end of the day. This just seems to be happening on a massive scale. Is that what's happening here again?
I'm not apolitical. I'm a classic sort of lib-lab, although I've given money to Republicans, I'm not a big, donations don't work for me because most of the time if they come public, they hurt the person. But so it's not about, the reality is we've gone nuts on foreign policy under Biden. And he has this group of guys around him, Tony Blinken, who was the Secretary of State, who has never been an ambassador, never worked in the State Department. He's been the handholder for Biden in his last 20, 30 years of Congress. Biden became, by seniority, he became chairman of he was chairman of the Judiciary Committee. He's been chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, and he's been there as his right-hand political guy. And the guy running the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan is his name, was Hillary's lawyer, among other things, when she had problems with Gmail. And the problems, I will tell you, if she'd been elected, she would have had a lot of problems for me. I'll tell you that, about what I know about that. And so you have the most experienced guy is Bill Burns, who was a Deputy Secretary of State, ambassador to Russia. But when he was ambassador to Russia about a decade ago, he retired after that, I think maybe one more tour, and he wrote a book about his experiences, warning not to keep NATO coming east because Russia at some point, Putin will sometime will go to war. He doesn't want NATO coming into, particularly in Ukraine. And you mentioned the story that I wrote a couple of weeks ago about corruption. And I'll just tell you, it was Burns himself had gone to see Zelensky in Kiev, and the message, and he wasn't alone. There were other people in his entourage, obviously, because God, he certainly isn't going to tell me this story. His message was, it turns out, and it's hard to get your head around this. Ukraine needs diesel fuel to run its war, they operate mostly on diesel. Refined diesel is much easier to refine than the kind of gas we use here, and I'm sure in England too. But you use a lot of diesel too for your trucks. Anyway, the military equipment, the tanks and everything run on diesel. And since the war began 14 months ago, he's been buying his diesel from Russia.
I can't fathom. So
Let me keep on going.
Okay, keep going.
It is a huge kickback involved. The agency, in its investment, is an internal analysis, figured out the kickback so far on the gas alone, the diesel gas, is $400 million. And there's a mechanism in Ukraine for spreading the money. You got to spread the money. And if you think about it, now every agency in the government, if you have to buy toilet paper for a division in the field, 20,000 troops, that's a lot of business. And all the agencies that used to deal directly with producers and manufacturers now have front companies. They've brought in a third party because that helps the skim. They can have more corruption. God knows what the real corruption is. It's in the billions, obviously. So the message the CIA director gives Zelensky, who we applaud as this great leader, is, hey, buddy, you got a lot of generals and senior guys in the government really pissed at you because, you're taking too much of the take. Cut back the percentage. I know this sounds like mob talk. I think I use that word. It's like out of a mafioso movie.
Yeah.
And so what he did was, we gave him a list of 35 people that we knew were corrupt in the bureaucracy, military and in the bureaucracy. And what he did was he fired 10. And the 10 he fired were the most ostentatious. And I'm here to tell you, I have not been there myself, but I've talked to people about this. Much of Kiev is an upper middle class world. It's high livers, guys with drivers, liquor stores where you can buy. I read a story the other day. You could buy a $600 bottle of rum if you want, even though that's not the drink of choice there. It's just a luxury land, parts of it, because there's so much skim, and the guys in the field, they know this. They know what's going on, which also doesn't help morale. It's not being reported, and so. He got rid of the 10 most ostentatious guys. And there we go. What are you going to do? Is the American government going to talk about it? And when I run this story with direct quotes from the conversation he had, not one paper picks up on it. And I think you're absolutely right. I think it's a visceral fear of the next election. Because you got a guy that's 80 and he's not, he had a talk 2 days ago in which I was told he began to wander. Which you do when you get older. Take it from me. You begin to wander around quite a bit.
And so just to summarize, the U.S. government is giving money to Zelensky. Zelensky and his crew are skimming a chunk off the top, and then they're buying diesel from Russia, their enemy, to continue to keep the war going. And the war is big business for the top echelon of the elite of Ukraine. The longer it goes, the more money they're going to make. The Biden administration knows they're taking some off the top, and the old mob boss comes in and says, look, we know you're skimming, but you're skimming too much. So keep skimming, but skim less, because we need you to keep this war going so I can get elected in the next 16 months. Because without a war going on, I got no chance. I barely have a chance with the war going on. And now that Trump is starting to open his mouth, I got even less chance. That's what you're saying is going on here.
You should have been a good editor. You said it in about 2 sentences. It's scary how simple it is.
Right.
It's all about re-election. And what happened today? Today, in my old newspaper, the New York Times, is a long story about how the leadership in Russia, Xi and others, are just walking away from us and cutting deals. They've cut deals with Saudi Arabia. We talked about what they're doing. And it's a long story, never mentions the fact that we have been, from the moment this group, Blinken, Winken, I call them Blinken, Winken, and Nod for Victoria Nuland. There's like a kid's story. They've been so outspokenly full of hate of Russia from the moment they got in. 2 months after they got in, they had the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, who, by the way, is personally apparently a very nice guy. I don't know him, but he just has long-standing hostility to everything communist. He met with the Chinese in Alaska, and he really pissed them off. He began telling them what they should start doing internally. We're a country with, I just wrote the other week about Guantanamo. I want to get into that. We murdered ourselves by putting those people, taking people, dragging them in, throwing them into jail, and mistreating them. In the Middle East, are you kidding? We're going to pay for that for a long time, what we did. No due process. Anyway, and so we have a Secretary of State a month ago, some balloons. We taught China, when China was our buddy against Russia, we taught them about using weather balloons for low-level, intelligence collection. We gave them the formula for it. We
Really?
did that about
I didn't know that.
about 3 decades ago.
Okay.
We taught them how to do it. And so the Secretary of State of the United States is supposed to go meet with his counterpart in China. There's been a lot of tension in relationships, and he canceled it because of a balloon that we shot down with a brand new Air Force plane. The plane was an F-22. It was the first combat mission of a plane. The cost overrun in America is always, because it's private enterprise, always it's like anybody has their house redone. There's always extras that the contractor comes to you with. There always is in the airplane business too. But I will tell you, what I'm telling you now is true. It's just a silly fact. The first combat mission of the F-22, this new plane, we have a base in Southeast America where they're based, and it's a fantastic plane. The first combat mission was destroying the balloon. And the pilot who did it fired the missile, that missile that probably cost 8 times as much as the balloon, $1 million missile, knocked it out, lands, and in World War II, I've read a lot about the air war in Britain. That's a classic. Talk about integrity and guts and intelligence and willing to die. But when they got the Messerschmitts, they used to plant them on the side, the little flags. And we did it with the P-51s and the Zeros against the Japanese Zeros. I go back to World War II. And so the guy came back and he planted mockingly a little balloon on the side of his plane. The first hit was a balloon. But the Secretary of State won't visit his counterpart because of a balloon.
Right. Well, let's talk about China briefly because it's a real issue. And then I definitely want to I really want to get your thoughts on Trump. And then I do want to finish with Guantanamo. But China, they're making serious moves. Every day I open up the paper or online news and boom, Xi's in Brazil. Boom, Xi's in the Middle East. Boom, UAE is selling oil based in the yuan. They're making major moves around the world, obviously with Belt and Road Initiative. They have this long game where they're thinking 100 years out, maybe 1,000 years out. And, our current administration is doing nothing to check them whatsoever. It's looking really dangerous. And they're refusing to engage at all with the U.S. or vice versa, by the way you're saying here. And it looks really dangerous what's going on right now.
China's writing us off. They've been writing us off. Now, finally, it was actually in the New York Times today writing us off. A long story about what China's doing, why they're writing us off. Not one mention of what the Biden administration hostility towards China has been. Hate, hate, hate. But everything Chinese, and China's got problems. They have the old Silk Road they want to build, the something road. They're down $70 billion on it. They've invested heavily in Navy bases. They put a lot of money into just a big natural harbor. In the Bahamas, they put a lot of money into it. They've done one in Nairobi. They've done one in Pakistan. In Pakistan, Karachi. They put money into, and they're not getting money back. People are stiffing them. So they actually have a currency problem. They have a lot of reason to want, and what's Biden going to do now? There's so much we do so much trade with them. He's now going to issue some orders. I understand, cutting back, sanctions, cutting back American willingness.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.